The world rarely notices when a war is fought not with bullets but with bowls. In a place most news cycles skip over, a silent crisis simmered for decades. Burkina Faso, a landlocked West African nation, quietly imported over half its rice each year, surrendering not just its meals, but its independence to the shifting whims of global trade. When prices rose in Asia, African mothers cut portions in silence. Farmers saw their harvests devalued, dismissed as inferior and forgotten. But in this hunger lay a deeper injustice, one not rooted in bad soil but in broken systems. The local rice was rich, nutritious, and time-honored, yet lacked the polish of imported brands. It wasn't just a crisis of food. It was a crisis of sovereignty. Then came a voice, not from abroad but from within. Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose not with foreign aid but with a new vision. Burkina Faso would feed itself, with pride. Do not scroll past this, because this story is not just about rice. It's about resistance. Subscribe and walk with us, for the day Africa feeds itself with pride. Long before the world's attention turned to conflicts or climate summits, a quieter battle raged across the dusty plains of Burkina Faso. It wasn't the kind of war that made headlines. There were no missiles, no tanks, no foreign troops. Instead, it was a battle for rice, a daily fight fought on farms, in kitchens, and through policies long ignored. The math was unforgiving. Burkina Faso required approximately 650,000 tons of rice each year, but its own fields could barely manage half that figure. The remaining shortfall, more than 350,000 tons, was filled by imports, primarily from Asia. These were not just numbers in a report. Every ton imported was a reminder that the nation had surrendered control over its most basic necessity. Every shipment reinforced a system where local farmers, despite their toil, were outmatched not by quality, but by processing, packaging, and market access. Worse still, over 200 rice mills, scattered across the countryside, stood in rusting silence. Once built with lofty promises of development, they had long been abandoned. Without them, local rice remained unprocessed, dismissed, and undervalued. Farmers grew grain they couldn't sell. Mothers fed children meals they could barely afford. And through it all, the narrative remained the same. This was just the cost of being a developing country. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré refused that story. To him, the so-called inevitability of underdevelopment was nothing more than a myth manufactured by neo-colonial economics. Dependency, he argued, was never natural. It was engineered. In a bold and unprecedented move, Traoré launched a national initiative to reclaim the country's food system. The cornerstone of this effort wasn't foreign investment or flashy aid packages. It was sovereignty. The plan was clear: revive Burkina Faso's rice sector using domestic resources, national pride, and the will of its people. First, the government turned its eyes to the decaying infrastructure. Those rusting rice mills were not lost causes, they were opportunities. Engineers were dispatched to assess what could be salvaged. Youth brigades were mobilized to assist in the rehabilitation, and instead of relying on expensive foreign machinery, local designers were challenged to produce affordable, locally adapted processing equipment. Then came the headline moment. 20 state-of-the-art optical sorters, each capable of processing 6 tons of rice per hour, were unveiled on November 30th, 2024, in the city of Bobo Dioulasso. But these machines were not donations wrapped in diplomatic strings. They were purchased outright, financed through the national budget with no external conditions. For the first time in its modern history, Burkina Faso had acquired cutting-edge technology not as aid, but as a sovereign investment. These optical sorters were technological marvels. Equipped with high-resolution sensors, they could detect and remove impurities invisible to the naked eye. Tiny stones, broken grains, even shards of glass. The result was rice that not only met international standards but rivaled the very imports that had long dominated local markets. Farmers who once watched their produce discarded as inferior now saw it transformed into export-quality grain. But the true power of these machines wasn't in their engineering, it was in their symbolism. Each sorter represented a blow against dependency, a declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer accept the role assigned to it by external powers. No longer a passive importer, no longer a silent recipient. but a producer, a refiner, and a proud participant in its own food destiny. Alongside the sorters, the government began building a supportive ecosystem. Investments were made in irrigation infrastructure to mitigate the dry season. Storage facilities were constructed to combat the nearly 20% post-harvest loss that had plagued farmers for years. And most critically, training programs were launched to equip communities with the skills needed to operate and maintain the equipment. Traoré's strategy was radical in its simplicity. Every element of the food chain, from seed to shelf, must be reclaimed. Food, he insisted, was not just a commodity, it was a right. And sovereignty could not be outsourced. The transformation was not instant, but it was visible. Where there had been rust, there was now rhythm. Where there had been despair, there was now a plan. And where there had been silent suffering, there was now a rallying cry. But could polished machines truly polish a nation's self-worth? November 30th, 2024, did not begin like a historic day. The city of Bobo Dioulasso buzzed as usual with market chatter, motorbikes humming through dusty streets, and farmers hauling sacks of grain. But in the city's industrial quarter, something extraordinary was unfolding, a moment that would become known not only for what it achieved, but for what it represented. In front of a gathered crowd of students, farmers, local officials, and foreign observers, Captain Ibrahim Traoré unveiled 20 high-tech optical rice sorters. Their sleek frames and polished lenses shimmered under the West African sun, but it wasn't their appearance that drew applause. It was their origin. These machines weren't donations dressed up as development. They hadn't arrived via aid packages with fine print in English or French. They were bought, paid for outright by Burkina Faso's own treasury. In a world where modern technology often arrived as a Trojan horse, filled with economic conditions and foreign oversight, this act was nothing short of revolutionary. And the machines delivered. Farmers watched, tears in their eyes, as their once-dismissed harvests passed through streams of light and sensor arrays, emerging clean, polished, and market-ready. Broken grains were removed. Impurities vanished. Packaging followed. The rice that came out the other end bore a new label, Ré du Faso, and a new meaning. It was not just food. It was evidence. Proof that Burkina Faso could compete, could produce, could lead. The crowd erupted, not just in applause, but in something deeper. Validation. For decades, the people had been told their products were too rustic, their technology too crude, their future too small. But here it was, an African solution with African money, African minds, and African control. "We are no longer beggars at the global table," one farmer declared. "We are cooks." The ripple effects were immediate. Supermarkets in Ouagadougou, once dominated by glossy Asian imports, began stocking shelves with domestically processed rice. Hotels and restaurants rewrote menus to feature Ré du Faso, celebrating local taste with national pride. Even urban elites, long conditioned to equate foreign with superior, began choosing Burkina rice not out of charity, but out of preference. Yet this shift in consumption was just one layer of the revolution. Beneath it, a deeper transformation took root. Across Bama, Dougou, and the rice belts of the West, old silos were refitted. Abandoned plants roared back to life. But this time, they weren't managed by foreign consultants or absentee investors. They were staffed and operated by young Burkina engineers, agronomists, packaging experts, and logistics coordinators, many of whom had once dreamed of leaving the country altogether. In villages once gripped by unemployment and despair, something radical began to happen. People stayed. And not just stayed, they built. A new economic pattern emerged, one that Traoré's administration would later call microeconomy autonomous. In this model, rice wasn't just a product. It was a foundation, a force around which communities could organize, economies could form, and dignity could flourish. Money no longer disappeared into the pockets of importers or foreign multinationals. It circulated, from farmer to mill worker, from shopkeeper to transporter, reinforcing local strength at every stage. Children once sent to fetch water now delivered cleanly packaged rice to village markets. Women who once bartered produce now led cooperatives, negotiated contracts, and set prices. Fathers spoke no longer of getting out, but of expanding plots and investing in machinery. It was a people-powered transformation, but it was not without attention and scrutiny. Beyond Burkina Faso, international observers watched with rising unease. What was happening in this small, landlocked country wasn't just about rice. It was about narrative, about a nation defying the script written for it by the global development machine. And worse, for some, it was working. What happens when one country proves it can reject aid, build its own systems, and succeed? What happens when that story begins to travel across borders? Indeed, in Ghana, whispers of local maize revolutions began. In Nigeria, cassava cooperatives referenced the Burkina model. In Niger, millet producers talked not of markets abroad, but of autonomous trade circles at home. A single act of rice sovereignty was becoming a continent-wide inspiration. But inspiration invites challenge. And as Burkina Faso's local rice claimed more shelf space, some foreign players began pushing back. Lobbyists urged free trade protections. Foreign firms warned of market distortions. And global media, once silent, began to paint the rice revolution in tones of skepticism, warning of unsustainable nationalism. Yet even in this there was clarity. The louder the resistance, the more it proved the threat Traoré's vision posed, not to peace or prosperity, but to control. Could this grain of revolution ripple across borders and shake the very foundation of aid economics? The rice revolution was never just about food. Its real harvest came in forms less visible but more enduring: dignity, employment, and political awakening. As the new ecosystem took root, so too did its effects ripple through the core of Burkinabe society. At the household level, the changes were immediate and personal. Farmers across the country, once at the mercy of volatile prices and middlemen, began to report yield increases between 20 to 30%. These improvements didn't stem from imported miracles. They came from access to storage, irrigation, and training designed for their land, their climate, their realities. Most critically, post-harvest losses, which had consumed nearly 1/5 of production, plummeted to under 5%. That alone meant hundreds of thousands of extra tons of rice were now available, not to be wasted, but to feed communities and power markets. But it was not just about feeding stomachs, it was about restoring agency. For the first time in years, farmers earned more than mere survival. They repaired their roofs, invested in tools, enrolled their children in schools, and in many cases, hired neighbors to help with expanding operations. It was a shift from subsistence to scale, from surviving to strategizing. By the end of 2024, over 10,000 stable jobs had been created within the rice value chain. These weren't precarious day labor gigs. These were skilled positions: machine operators, irrigation technicians, agronomists, cooperative managers, packaging designers, transport coordinators, many held by young Burkinabe graduates who, until recently, had seen no place for themselves at home. This was more than an economic bump. It was a generational reversal. For decades, youth migration had drained Burkina Faso of its energy and promise. The best minds, people used to say, don't stay. Now those minds were wiring machinery in Dougou, mapping logistics in Bama, and branding Riz de Faso in Ouagadougou. And then something happened that no economist could fully measure. Hope returned. It filled markets with chatter, homes with dreams, and public squares with conversations about building rather than fleeing. This new hope was not naive. It knew that the path ahead was long, but it was grounded in something powerful: proof. Proof that an African nation could break with dependency and succeed. Proof that sovereignty, when applied not only to borders but to bread, could change lives. On the political front, the rice revolution redefined how government was perceived. Traoré's administration, often dismissed abroad as radical or inexperienced, gained deep legitimacy at home, not through propaganda, but through performance. Factories ran. Jobs came. Prices stabilized. For the average citizen, these outcomes mattered more than ideology. Critics had warned that rejecting the IMF and World Bank would collapse the economy. Instead, it empowered it. By keeping production, value addition, and consumption within borders, Burkina Faso insulated itself, not fully, but meaningfully, from the tremors of global trade wars and shipping disruptions. This autonomy inspired a new political discourse, one rooted in self-definition. No longer were policies evaluated by how well they aligned with donor expectations. They were judged by how well they served Burkina Faso families. And as local rice replaced imported brands, a strange transformation occurred in public consciousness. Rice became political. Choosing local wasn't just a matter of price, it was a statement. A quiet, daily act of defiance against a system that had long written Burkina Faso's story in someone else's ink. In this climate, new political language emerged. Phrases like economic independence, post-aid sovereignty, soil over signature. Words that once felt like slogans became realities. And with each ton of locally grown, locally milled rice, the myth of perpetual underdevelopment crumbled. But the government also knew the battle was not over. With new gains came new risks. What if drought struck? What if rice prices collapsed globally? What if powerful nations, threatened by this independence, began to retaliate economically? The questions were real and haunting. But the foundation had been laid. Burkina Faso had moved beyond survival into strategy. It had shifted from waiting for solutions to building them. And most importantly, it had turned food from a burden into a tool of political identity. Now, the question must be asked and answered. If you believe Burkina Faso rice sovereignty is what Africa has always needed, say it loud in the comments below. But can a grassroots food movement survive the global storm waiting beyond the silos? As the rice mills of Burkina Faso roared back to life and shelves in Ouagadougou filled with Made in Faso labels, the tremors of this quiet revolution began to echo far beyond the country's borders. What began as a national food program soon posed an unsettling question to the global development order. What happens when an African nation stops asking for help and wins? In the corridors of international institutions, from Washington, D.C., to Brussels, the tone began to shift. Where there had once been silence, there was now cautious scrutiny. Reports surfaced warning of nationalistic overreach and market imbalances. Foreign consultants suggested that local subsidies might distort fair competition, and behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Some Western governments, uncomfortable with the precedent being set, began to reevaluate aid flows. Policy advisors floated conditions. Perhaps Burkina Faso should demonstrate its commitment to open markets before receiving trade benefits. Others hinted that foreign direct investment might dry up unless the country relaxed its state-led initiatives. But what truly unnerved global observers wasn't policy, it was popularity. The Burkina Faso model was working. And worse, for those invested in the current system, it was being noticed. Across the Sahel and beyond, civil society leaders, journalists, and young entrepreneurs began referencing the Burkina example. They asked questions once considered taboo. Why must food security depend on foreign aid? Why do development plans arrive already printed in Paris or Washington? Why are the hands that feed Africa not allowed to feed their own nations first? In Ghana, maize cooperatives began organizing under the slogan, "Grow local, eat proud." In Nigeria, cassava processors cited Burkina Faso's local ownership model. In Mali, youth leaders began calling for nationalized agricultural training programs. And in each case, the whisper behind the movement was the same. If they can do it, why not us? The reaction wasn't just regional. Even in Western media, articles began to appear, sometimes supportive, often skeptical. Words like populist, unsustainable, and isolationist were used to describe Traoré's policies. Opinion pieces warned that Burkina Faso's path might alienate international partners. Yet buried within these critiques was a nervous admiration, the uncomfortable recognition that something powerful was taking root. But what did the United States say? Publicly, official statements were cautious. "We support development that is inclusive and sustainable," a State Department spokesperson said in early 2025. But behind the platitudes, think tanks published papers questioning the replicability of the Faso model. Trade envoys began quietly lobbying for market access guarantees on behalf of American agribusiness exporters. Rice diplomacy had begun. For decades, Africa's agricultural dependency had been a pillar of global trade. Now, a small West African nation was challenging that pillar, not with protest, but with production. And this posed the ultimate challenge to the global order. If one country could redefine food sovereignty, how long before others followed? If this is a battle of models, whose side will the world choose? Burkina Faso's rice revolution has awakened something long dormant in the African imagination, not just the will to resist, but the capacity to rebuild. Yet as history teaches, the true test of transformation is not in the launch, but in the long road that follows. The first challenge ahead is water. A landlocked nation vulnerable to droughts and erratic rainfall, Burkina Faso must now scale its irrigation systems far beyond current capacities. The government has invested in canals, small dams, and low-cost pumping systems, but climate change continues to rewrite seasonal rhythms. Floods ravage delicate soil. Desertification creeps forward, hectare by hectare. To sustain what has begun, irrigation must evolve from reactive to resilient. This means tapping into innovation, training engineers to design smart water systems, deploying solar-powered irrigation across rural belts, and transforming rain-fed fields into controlled environments. In doing so, Burkina Faso could become a laboratory for African climate adaptation, where the scarcity of water births a culture of ingenuity. The second test is market resilience. Local rice is thriving, but the global grain trade is ruthless. A shipping crisis in the Red Sea, an export ban in Asia, or a geopolitical skirmish can send price waves crashing into African kitchens. Burkina Faso must now protect both its producers and consumers. This means buffer stocks, price stabilization funds, and stronger cooperatives capable of negotiating on behalf of their members, not bowing to middlemen. But perhaps the most delicate challenge is human capital. The revolution has created over 10,000 jobs, and for the first time in generations, youth are staying. But employment alone is not enough. Young people must be given space to create, innovate, and lead. They must design next-generation rice varieties, develop branding strategies, and push agritech solutions born in Bobo Dioulasso, not Boston. Only then will the movement become irreversible. This is where the choice lies, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa. Do we continue to wait for solutions wrapped in conditions, or do we cultivate them ourselves? Do we see sovereignty as a speech or as a system we build day by day, meal by meal? Across the continent, the whispers are growing louder. If they reclaimed rice, why not maize in Ghana? Cassava in Nigeria? Millet in Niger? The model is not in factories or policies, it's in mindset. In rejecting dependency as a destiny and choosing development as design. And so the path ahead forks, one of caution, one of courage. To the nations watching, the message is clear. This is not about scale, but soul. Not about copying the Burkina model, but learning from its defiance. A reminder that food is not just about sustenance, it is a flag. And sovereignty, as Burkina Faso has shown, can grow in the soil. Will this seed of sovereignty take root across the continent or be uprooted by global pressure? What began as a crisis over rice became a revelation of strength. In a world where aid is sold as salvation and dependence is disguised as development, Burkina Faso stood up, not with protest, but with planting. Not with theories, but with tractors. And in that act, it reshaped what sovereignty looks like. Burkina Faso rice sovereignty is no longer an abstract goal, it is a daily practice. It lives in the factories of Bobo Dioulasso, in the irrigation fields of Dougou, in the supermarket shelves of Ouagadougou. It is the hum of local machines, the pride in a farmer's voice, the quiet rebellion of choosing local over imported. Each bag of rice is a silent anthem. We are no longer asking to eat. We are feeding ourselves. The impact is measurable. Over 10,000 jobs, a surge in income, a reduction in post-harvest loss. But numbers alone don't capture the spirit. What matters more is what cannot be counted. The young engineers who stayed, the mothers who feed their children without fear, the fathers who speak of expansion, not escape. Yet, this is not just a national triumph. It is a continental question. In a world still eager to define Africa through poverty, aid, and exports, food sovereignty, Africa challenges that narrative. It asks, what if we designed our own futures? What if we cultivated value instead of extracting it? What if dignity came not from signatures on foreign loans, but from seeds in native soil? Burkina Faso didn't just grow rice. It grew hope. It grew pride. It grew a new identity rooted in autonomy. And that is why the rice revolution matters, not because it filled bowls, but because it filled the future. If this grain of truth struck a chord in you, don't just move on. Like, share, and speak up. Subscribe, for Africa's future will not be dictated, it will be cultivated. Drop your thoughts below. Say Africa new if you believe the continent is rising. Say it's time for Africa if you believe it starts now. Because this story is no longer theirs. It is ours. It is not only about Burkina Faso rice sovereignty, it is about food sovereignty Africa.